The pump had been running since sunrise, and by 9 o'clock, Walt Renner could finally see the bottom of the pond for the first time in 11 years. It wasn't supposed to look like this. Beneath the drying mud, something ran in a straight, unnatural line. Too straight for a tree root, too long for a fence post. Walt stood at the edge in his rubber boots, watching the last of the brown water gurgle down the drain pipe, and felt something tighten in his chest. He climbed down into the muck. When he scraped away the first layer with his boot heel, he found wood. Old wood, blackened and swollen, but cut. Cut by a saw, not broken by nature. Then he saw the metal. A flat iron plate, half buried, with letters stamped into the surface. He knelt down and wiped the mud away with his thumb until a date came into focus. 1946. Walt's grandfather hadn't even bought this farm until 1952. So the question wasn't just what was buried under his pond. It was, who put it there first? And why did somebody want it hidden underwater? If you love true rural mysteries, the kind of forgotten history that's still sitting quietly under working farms, stick around, because this one gets stranger before it gets clear. Subscribe if these stories are your thing. And before we get into it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Walt Renner was 58 years old and had spent nearly his whole life on the same 140-acre farm outside a small town in the Midwest, 3 generations deep, in corn, soybeans, and a small herd of cattle that grazed the back pasture. The pond sat at the northeast corner of the property, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods. It had been there as long as anyone could remember, a half-acre of water that, in Walt's childhood, had been clear enough to see turtles resting on sunken logs. Kids from 3 farms over used to fish it on summer evenings. But over the past decade, the pond had died. The water had turned a thick, soupy green. Algae choked the surface every July. The fish stopped biting, then stopped surviving. Frogs disappeared. Even the cattle avoided drinking from it, wading instead to the creek on the far side of the property. Walt figured it was just old age. Ponds silt in, nutrients build up, oxygen drops. Standard stuff for anyone who'd farmed long enough to watch water bodies change with the decades. But this felt faster than natural decline should allow. That spring, with cattle prices tight and the farm's equipment budget stretched thin, Walt made a decision he'd been putting off for years. He was going to drain the pond, dredge it out, and either restore it properly or fill it in and reclaim the acreage for pasture. He hired a small excavator, rented a trash pump, and on a cool Tuesday morning in April, he opened the outlet valve and watched 11 years of stagnant water begin to disappear. He wasn't expecting the bottom to tell him a story. By mid-morning, most of the water was gone, leaving a crater of gray-black mud that steamed faintly in the cool air. Walt walked the perimeter first, the way his father taught him. Always look before you dig. The ground will tell you things machinery can't. That's when he found the straight line of wood. It ran roughly north to south, about 10 feet long, spaced with what looked like evenly cut posts. Not a fallen tree, not debris, something built. He called his neighbor, Dale Whitcomb, over that afternoon. Dale was 73, had farmed the adjoining property his whole life, and had a memory for the county that outlasted most of the old plat maps. Dale stood at the edge of the drained pond for a long moment before saying anything. "You found that down there?" "Found it this morning. There's an iron plate too, with a date on it, 1946. Dale didn't answer right away. He walked down into the mud himself, knelt beside the wood, and ran a weathered hand along its edge. "I know what this used to be," he said finally. Then he straightened up, looked out across the flattened, muddy bowl where the pond used to sit, and added nothing more. Walt waited. Dale just shook his head slowly, like a man deciding how much of a story was his to tell. "Talk to your Aunt Cordelia before you tear any more of it out," Dale said. "This might mean more than you think." Over the next 2 days, working carefully with hand tools instead of the excavator, Walt began exposing more of the structure. What he'd first mistaken for a random collection of timber turned out to be a framework, a series of wooden channels, reinforced with iron brackets, running in a shallow grid across roughly a third of the pond's floor. It looked almost like a low wooden flume system, the kind used decades ago to direct water flow by gravity rather than by pump. He photographed everything before moving another shovelful. This was where the story stopped being simple, because a flume system like this wasn't something you'd bury under a pond by accident. Someone had built it deliberately, and, at some point, someone else had deliberately covered it with water. Walt drove into town and visited his aunt, the last surviving relative who remembered the farm before his grandfather bought it. Cordelia was 89, sharp-eyed, and unsurprised by his questions. "Before your grandfather's time," she said, "that corner of the property belonged to a man named Elmer Bostwick. Different farm back then, before the parcels got split and sold in the 50s. Elmer had one of the first gravity-fed irrigation setups in the county, ran water off a spring at the high end of the property, down through wooden channels, out to fields that don't even belong to this farm anymore. So what happened to it? Drought hit hard in the late 40s. Spring dried up for 2 summers straight. Elmer lost the farm to the bank in 51. Way I heard it, the family that bought the land afterward didn't want the old channels sitting empty and rotting. A liability, mud pit, whatever they called it back then. Easiest thing to do was let the low spot fill in and call it a pond. Walt sat with that for a moment. His pond, the one he'd fished in as a boy, the one that had slowly died over the last decade, hadn't started as a pond at all. It had started as somebody's lifeline. Here was the twist that changed everything Walt thought he understood about his own land. The pond wasn't a natural feature that had simply aged and declined. It had been a working irrigation channel, deliberately flooded and buried nearly 75 years earlier, when it stopped being useful to anyone. That explained something that had puzzled generations of renters: why the pond always sat slightly higher than the surrounding field, held in place by an unnatural, almost too even berm. It wasn't geology, it was engineering. It also explained why the pond had died so much faster than a natural one should. Beneath the sediment, the old wooden flume system had been slowly collapsing for decades, disrupting drainage patterns and trapping nutrients and organic material that would normally flush through a healthy pond system. The very thing that once moved water efficiently across the land had, buried and rotting, been quietly suffocating it from below. The forecast that Friday called for 2 inches of rain moving in by Sunday night, enough to refill the drained basin and undo a week of careful excavation. The rented pump and excavator were due back at the equipment yard Monday morning, and Walt couldn't justify the extra rental cost with calving season eating into the farm's cash flow. He had roughly 48 hours to see how much of the old system he could safely uncover, document, and understand before the water came back and buried it all over again, possibly for another 75 years. Working through Saturday with his son and Dale Whitcomb, Walt cleared mud from the central section of the flume grid. The wood here was better preserved, protected by an especially thick layer of clay that had sealed out oxygen for decades. The same reason old fence posts and buried timbers sometimes survive far longer underwater than in open air. Near what appeared to be the system's central junction, Walt's shovel struck something solid that wasn't wood or iron. He knelt, cleared the mud by hand, and found the edge of a stone-lined basin, roughly 4 feet across, built into the earth itself. He was close. He could feel it. Then the excavator's hydraulic line ruptured, spraying fluid across the mud and forcing an immediate stop to any machine work. Walt swore under his breath, checked the sky, clouding over faster than the forecast had promised, and made the call to keep digging by hand, racing the weather with shovels and buckets instead. By late Saturday afternoon, the basin was clear enough to see clearly. It wasn't just a stone-lined pit. Built into its base was a hand-forged iron valve mechanism, remarkably intact, still attached to a wooden gate that once controlled how much spring water flowed out to Elmer Bostwick's fields nearly 80 years earlier. Beside it, wedged into the stonework, was a second iron plate, smaller than the first, hand-stamped rather than manufactured. E. Bostwick, 1946. Elmer had built this himself, by hand, the same year he'd likely believed his farm's future was secure. 5 years later, drought and debt took it all away, and this valve, the heart of his entire water system, was buried and forgotten under a pond that would outlast his memory in the county by 7 decades. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't dramatic in the way Hollywood tells stories, but standing in that mud, holding a hand-forged valve gate built by a man who'd lost everything, Walt understood he wasn't just looking at old iron. He was looking at someone's hope, preserved by accident in clay and water. Walt didn't fill the pond back in. Instead, working with a local historical society Dale connected him with, he had the valve system carefully documented, stabilized, and left in place, with a small marker at the pond's edge explaining what lay beneath the water once it was allowed to refill. He also redesigned the pond's drainage to finally address the decades-old blockage the collapsing flume system had been causing, the real reason the water had been dying for years. Within a season, the pond began clearing. Frogs returned by early summer. His grandchildren waded in that August for the first time in over a decade. Walt kept the smaller iron plate, E. Bostwick, 1946, on a shelf in the farmhouse, where his grandfather's tools had always sat. For 11 years, Walt had seen only a dying pond and a problem he didn't have time to fix. He never imagined that underneath it all along was the last piece of another farmer's story, one that ended in loss, but had finally, quietly, been given the chance to be remembered.